School leader. Hey, we're continuing in the unit that's entitled Stand Up, How to Fight Injustice. This is week 2. It's called Stand with Conviction. It's out of Esther chapter 2, verses 21 through chapter 3, verse 6. And the point of the lesson is that it is always right to do the right thing. Now, last week, at least in our class, we talked about several different kinds of injustices that still exist in the world. And one of those that was brought up was human trafficking. And unfortunate but timely in the fact that a well-known actress that played on Smallville, the TV show Smallville, was arrested for her involvement in the recruitment for human trafficking for a particular organization. And so it's just important to note that human trafficking, along with other injustices, it's not something that just happens in some back alley in some Asian country somewhere. It's happening right here under our noses, and we need to stand up against it when we're confronted with these things. Now, again, this week in this lesson, we're going to have some more of those difficult Old Testament names. And even with some practice, I went into class and still stumbled over a couple of the names as I read them. So that's going to happen, so don't worry about it. Just go on. Now, we continue in that saga out of the book of Esther. And this week's lesson deals more with Mordecai. Now remember, he's Esther's uncle who raised her. And what we see this week is that he did the right thing. Actually, he did two right things. First of all, he did the right thing. He spoke up against some wrongdoing. And the second thing is that he did not do the wrong thing, which actually is doing the right thing, isn't it? So in the first part of our text, Mordecai learns of a plot to assassinate the king. And so he tells his niece, Queen Esther, about this, and she relays that information to the king and credits Mordecai with that information. And after an investigation, it's determined that it's a true plot. And so the two perpetrators are impaled on poles. Yikes. That's pretty severe, isn't it? Well, the Persians were all about justice. Mercy, maybe not so much. Now, I created a tiny URL, okay? That's where you take a web page that's this long, and you can go to tinyurl.com, put that in, and it creates a much smaller version, so you don't have to type in near as much information. Anyway, that's listed, that URL is listed below my picture here. And what I've done there, I came across an article that lists 10 horrific ancient Persian punishments. So you know your class, you may or may not want to discuss these. Some of them are kind of gruesome, and for the squeamish in your class, you may not want to discuss some of those. But anyway, what's interesting is being impaled on poles did not make the top 10, so that's interesting, isn't it? Well, the first thing here that we see about Mordecai is that he did the right thing. He heard something that bad was going to happen. Bad was going to happen to the king, and so he reported it. Now, we tell kids in school, don't we? If you know someone's bullying, say something. Do something about it. But the same reasons that kids don't want to tell someone about bullying, the same kind of risks that Mordecai took in reporting this plot. What would that include? That would include retaliation, right? Physical harm, verbal abuse, perhaps the ruining of a reputation. All those kids are afraid of. Mordecai probably was afraid of as well, and we're going to face that too. Also, you could be labeled as a tattletale. Now everyone knows when they're around you, they're going to be on edge. They're not sure what you can be trusted with. And so, same thing with kids in school, with us, with Mordecai. So all these things are probably going through his mind, but he stood up and did the right thing anyway. So just like kids in school, just like Mordecai, we have to make a choice when we see something that's wrong. We either get involved or we don't get involved. Too many times we just shrug our shoulders, turn a blind eye, hope that someone else is going to take care of it until it personally affects us. Now remember, what's the point of the lesson? The point of the lesson is it's always right to do the right thing. It's not always convenient. It's not always free, meaning that it may cost something, but it's always right. Now after this plot was discovered, King Xerxes honored a man in his kingdom, in his court, named Haman. He elevated him to a high position. And the king commanded that all kneel down and pay honor to him, pay honor to Haman at the city's gate. But Mordecai refused. Now, exactly why, we don't know. It could have been because of religious reasons. I'm not going to bow down to anyone. It could have been because Haman was a descendant of the Amalekite king Agag, and you can see some more information about that in your leader guide. But for whatever the reason, Mordecai did not do what everyone else is doing. Just because it's popular doesn't mean it's right. Just because everybody else is doing it doesn't make it right. Just because it's legal doesn't make it right, does it? Now, Mordecai's situation was very similar. It was the same situation that this guy in the 1930s found himself in. August Landmesser. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but that's how I'm going to pronounce his name. Now, he's the man in this picture who is not saluting Hitler in 1936. You can find out more about his story and read about him online. We need to be this guy. Just because everybody else is doing it and it's wrong, we don't need to do it. There are other Bible characters as well that face similar situations, didn't they? In the book of Daniel, we see the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who would not bow down and worship that image of gold. They were thrown into the fiery furnace, of course, and delivered from that. Also, Daniel himself refused to offer prayers to King Darius. And what was his punishment? He was thrown into the lion's den. Now, in these two instances, God miraculously intervened. He does not always do that. Sometimes doing what's right, by not doing what's wrong, especially, it can be costly, and it can even cost someone their life. So as the story ends this week, this is like one of those serials, that continues to be continued. And then the next week you pick up the next part of the story. But as our story ends this week, Haman is outraged because this guy Mordecai is not bowing down to him. He finds out that Mordecai is a Jew, and so he wants to get even. He wants to kill not only him, but all of his people. He wants to kill all the Jews in the kingdom. That'll show him, won't it? Well, one of our Sunday school teachers here at my church is named Greg, and he sent me this article just this morning that goes right along with this week's lesson. Many of you may know the name Dean Smith, especially I know I have some viewers in North Carolina that would know that name. Dean Smith was the head basketball coach at North Carolina for 36 years. When he arrived at Chapel Hill in 1958 as an assistant, he was outraged that Chapel Hill still had restaurants that were segregated. So he didn't know what to do. He talked to his pastor, and so here was his plan. He took a black member of their congregation, of the church he went to, which in 1958, that's a pretty bold step too, right? To have a mixed congregation. So anyway, he took a black member of his congregation. They went out to eat. Now he specifically went to a restaurant where the management knew him. So he and his companion, they were served, and that was the beginning of desegregation, especially in restaurants there in Chapel Hill. Now, years later, he was questioned about that incident, about that story, and he was asked if he were proud of that moment in his life. And his shocking answer was no, that he really wasn't. And when pressed for an answer why, he replied this: "You should never be proud of doing what's right. You should just do what's right." Okay, that's the bottom line here. You shouldn't expect, and you certainly don't deserve, a pat on the back for doing the right thing, because it's always right to do the right thing. So, as the Nike slogan goes, just do it. All right? Hope you have a great Sunday school class. Don't forget to pray for your members, and that's all for this week.